And I will unmute Steve, just so I don't forget later on. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this coffee with the Conference Center. I'm not having coffee right now. The air conditioning is not working on our side of the building, so it's warm enough without coffee. Today's presentation, or SIP number 5, is entitled Faithful Citizenship. And this presentation was created and is facilitated by the unrelenting Dr. Stephen P. Millies, author, political theorist, and director of the Bernardin Center at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. So first and foremost, welcome. Second, in addition to washing your hands, wearing your masks, and social distancing, a request for prayer. Pray for our world, those who are sick, those whom have died, and all of us who struggle in various ways within this pandemic. Pray that health and safety may return across our world and nation. And let us take a moment of silence to petition God. Thank you. Now, please know that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared on the Cenacle's YouTube page at a later date. Any and all opinions expressed in this webinar may or may not reflect the opinions of the Cenacle or the Cenacle Sisters. Additionally, everyone except for Steve is now muted, and myself. Much like the previous presentations, Steve will guide us along until we arrive upon some questions or time for dialogue. At that point, we will unmute and engage in a conversation before we wrap this up. When we get to the conversation, if you'd like to share something, please begin by stating your name and location so we can have some level of community within this distant technology. If you really have a pressing question, you can use the chat box and we can assess what's going on. With that, allow me to turn this over to Steve.
Thanks very much, Mark. My thanks to the Cenacle, to the sisters and the staff there, and to everyone who's joining us today. This topic that I'm here about to begin speaking about is something that I've been spending about the last 30 years thinking about. I was just noting that I'm still changing my mind about stuff as we go, and I hope that's a good sign. But in any event, I hope that as we are living through a difficult time and coming upon a very important election, that all of this can be fruitful and we can aim at a good conversation. I prepared about 40 minutes of material here as my stopwatch had it earlier today. And after that, I will, in the words of our host, relentlessly take any questions from all comers. I'm looking forward to a dialogue at the end of this. But in the name of leaving time for that, let me begin with a little story. When I was interviewed for America Magazine's podcast about my book, Good Intentions, in 2018, they surprised me with their last question. Are there any spiritual authors or other places I look for inspiration in these troubled and polarized times? And I was having a sort of a tunnel vision experience that I think happens a lot in interviews. I was trying to answer the questions, trying to frame a consistent narrative that builds in my answers, trying not to forget what I wrote in my own book. Being interviewed like that is not easy, and so the question threw me. And like a lot of times when we don't know what to say, I accidentally blurted out the truth. I had the volume of Alfred Delp's prison writings on my desk. My eye fell on it, and I confessed that Delp had been saying a lot to me. Delp was a German Jesuit born in 1907 and executed by the Nazis for his resistance activities in 1945. Delp has some tough things to say about the fact of Nazism, about the church, and about we believers at work in the world. There's insight to be found in Delp, but not much comfort. I came to Delp many years ago through Thomas Merton. Merton wrote the introduction to the first edition of Delp's Prison Meditations in 1963, and here is Merton in that introduction. One of the most sobering aspects of this book is the conviction it imparts that we may one day be in the same desperate situation as the writer. Father Delp reminds us that somewhere in the last 50 years, we've crossed a mysterious limit set by Providence and have entered a new era. In this new era, the social structures into which Christianity had fitted so comfortably and naturally have all but collapsed. The meditations of Father Delp were written not only in the face of his own death, but in the terrifying presence of this specter of a faceless being that was once the image of God. Christians themselves are confused and passive, looking this way and that for indications of what to do or think next. Merton goes on, the dominating factor in the political life of the average Christian today is fear of communism, but as Father Delp shows, the domination of fear completely distorts the true perspectives of Christianity, and it may well happen that those whose religious activity reduces itself in the long run to a mere negation will find that their faith has lost all content. And of course, that's not even Delp yet. That's still Merton. But you begin to get a taste of why I've been preoccupied by Delp in the last 5 years or so. Fear of communism's gone, though fear of socialism isn't. But the Christianity of negation, in one form or another, has proven to be very durable. It is the unnamed condition that dominates our time, I think. The circumstances of Delp's resistance and arrest are not all that interesting, for as much as his prison reflections are. Delp had been part of the Kreisau Circle, a group of mostly, though not exclusively, Catholics who held a series of secret meetings to plan for the reconstruction of Germany after the Nazi defeat. Delp's input had been sought for his insights on labor issues. He was a keen student of Catholic social teaching who'd sought training in Munich in social philosophy. All in all, that was it. Delp was arrested in 1944. His trial was a mockery. The presiding judge made a number of venomous statements about Jesuits, which made clear Delp could not be acquitted. He wrote after the trial to his Jesuit community that the actual basis for the judgment is that I'm a Jesuit, and I've remained one. The atmosphere of the trial was so infused with hatred and enmity. Its fundamental thesis, a Jesuit is a priori an enemy and an opponent of the Reich. The whole thing was, on the one hand, a farce, and on the other, it became the defining motif of my life. And that's it. No secret messages passed, no involvement in assassination plots. Delp was merely a victim of how Nazi Germany felt about a Jesuit priest, as much as any Roma or Jew was a victim in a similar way. All that was different was that Delp had a trial, or at least something resembling one. The somewhat unexpectedly dull circumstances that led to Delp's death by hanging on February 2nd, 1945, do little to blunt the forceful impact of his diagnosis of how Germans found themselves in such a situation. An extraordinary essay Alfred Delp wrote in prison, The Tasks in Front of Us, is where I want to begin these reflections today on faithful citizenship in 2020. Our own circumstances are too familiar, and I think perhaps we're a little inured to hearing about the deterioration of our political life. What's happened in our politics and the ways how we construe our religious commitments have become implicated in the deterioration of our politics can make it a little difficult to hear a really tough assessment of where we now are. Familiarity can soften the impact. But hearing that familiarity echoed in Delp's almost 80-year-old essay, written with hands chained in a prison cell awaiting his death, may shake us a little bit out of that familiarity and alert us to the actual dimensions of our situation far more than a simple recitation of our circumstances. With Delp fixed firmly in our gaze, next I'll talk about 2020 with a particular emphasis on the faithful citizenship document produced by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and both the strengths and the weaknesses of that approach. And finally, we can turn our attention concretely to how we can address the tasks in front of us in the here and now of 2020. Now, Alfred Delp was a lover of history. History gave shape to his engagement with social philosophy, what I might call political theory, since that's where my training is. But like Delp, I also use a historical method when I think about our social and political realities today. All of our politics is, in a sense, an argument about history. That's the sum of the core argument between liberals and conservatives. Liberalizing revolutions that followed the decline of feudalism sought to overthrow what was old and replace it with a modernizing wave of something new. Conservatives, in reply, argued that everything old is not necessarily bad and some of the past should be conserved. When you begin to think about it in this way, you can begin to see how all of our politics is shaped to one degree or another by the usefulness we think we can find in history. Our internal arguments inside the Catholic Church are very much the same, by the way. An argument between Vatican II Catholics and traditionalist Catholics is, again, an argument about how we should use history. Centuries before our political arguments, Christians thought about themselves on a historical journey through time in the world towards salvation in Christ. We believers still think that way, of course, but this other modern way of thinking about the accumulation of human experience and history as something we can use or discard is new. And it's the place where Delp's essay, The Tasks in Front of Us, begins. Delp starts with this insightful comment. Those who make history are swayed by conditions as they find them, by the dynamics of situations, and by the rhythm of their own individual characters. They can affect trivial and unimportant matters, and they also can affect whole states, bringing decisions as to the fate of nations down to the narrowest personal level. In fact, the peculiarities of our individual lives, Delp tells us, hold world historic importance. We are the ones who make history, whether we think we do or not. But the rhythm of our own individual characters and the dynamics of our situations resonate beyond the narrow confines of our lives. We live and are at work in the world, and our lives have impact. This is a lesson of history. We are the makers of history, and either we learn from the past, or Delp tells us, events will master us. We will contribute, unwittingly perhaps, to the chaos and disorder that comes about when we don't take up our responsibility to work for justice in the world. Every age and nation has its mission in history, Delp wrote, and the sooner they realize this and set about fulfilling their role, the quicker they'll escape from history's ruthlessness to a state of comparative peace. We have a responsibility for history because what we do with the history we've inherited will become the history someone else inherits, inevitably. We have to fulfill our role. And Delp tells us this is particularly true for those of us who believe in the Christian gospel. He wrote, my own opinion is that our situation today offers possibilities and responsibilities for Christians. It's not a major task, but it's still a function Christians are capable of performing if they take their purpose in life seriously, because they know of the supernatural influence on history. We Christians know what pre-modern people knew. History is an arena for our salvation, because we believe what they believed. History aims toward the end of time, where all things become one in Christ. The salvific importance of history, collectively and individually, is the purpose of history, because it's the purpose of creation and of our lives in creation. Yet writing from his prison cell in Nazi Germany, perhaps it shouldn't surprise us that Delp was pessimistic. He had his reasons. And from his cell, Delp could write that the world of the 20th century had seen a breakdown of the inner standard which should have controlled our choices and safeguarded our ability to master the conditions in which we live. I think this was what Merton was getting at in his introduction. Somewhere in the last 50 years, we've crossed the mysterious limit set by Providence and have entered a new era. For all the promise of modern life and the freedom that citizens enjoy that permit them to exercise their religious beliefs publicly, the lure of all that freedom somehow has induced in us a failure to take ourselves and our humanity seriously as being created with a divine purpose to a divine pattern. We've gotten lost in the modern world, somehow lost our way just at a moment when it became possible for us to become fully active as Christians in the world, to bring to the world the gospel of peace, mercy, and love. And I remind you that Alfred Delp wrote this almost 80 years ago. The most curious feature of Delp's writings, and the one I want to focus my attention on here today, is where Delp fixed the blame. Unlike so many of the public Christians today who condemn godlessness or liberalism or progressivism or socialism or atheism, Delp fixed the blame squarely on churches. He noted how, quote, religion in the past has often preoccupied itself so little with the practical problems of everyday life that it has been discredited. And another long passage is worth quoting. A church that makes demands in the name of a peremptory God no longer carries weight in a world of changing values. The new generation is separated from the clear conclusions of our traditional theology by a mountain of boredom and disillusion thrown up by past experience. We have destroyed people's confidence in us by the way we live. We cannot expect 2,000 years of history to be an unmixed blessing and recommendation. History can be a handicap too. But recently, he goes on, the person turning to the church for enlightenment has all too often found only a tired man to receive him, a man who then had the dishonesty to hide his fatigue under pious words and fervent gestures. And he concludes, at some future date, the honest historian will have some bitter things to say about the contribution made by the churches to the creation of the mass mind, collectivism, dictatorships, and so on. And in sum, that long quotation is why we turn our attention to Alfred Delp. We want to notice a lot of things of that long quotation. Certainly, we want to note the familiarity, I think, of his description of the weary church hiding its fatigue behind pious words and fervent gestures. But there's a more important point, too. The church that relied for so many centuries on its own unquestionable authority as a source of power and influence has played a role in the creation of the mass mind, collectivism, dictatorships, and so on. As much as history has brought us to a moment where the ordinary person, as a citizen, voter, and believer, can claim her or his rightful place as an equal participant in the creation of history, the long habit of unquestioned obedience has had its poisonous effect. We have learned, and learned too well, how to obey, how to follow, and how not to question. 2,000 years of history is not an unmixed blessing indeed. And here we'd want to pause and take note of the concrete historical circumstances that Delp was responding to. There were courageous women and men in German churches who opposed Hitler, but the silence and complicity of too many religious leaders also had its regrettable effect. Protestant churches were co-opted by the Nazis. Catholic theologians like Joseph Lortz, Michael Schmaus, Karl Adam attempted to harmonize Germany's National Socialism with Roman Catholicism. And perhaps some of you have seen the photographs of Catholic bishops with their hands raised in the Nazi salute, swearing loyalty to the German Reich. These things must have been in the mind of Alfred Delp as he reflected on the tasks in front of us in his prison cell. The Catholic Church, throughout its 2,000 years of history, has struggled in its relationship with many sorts of states with which it has coexisted. Early Christians lived under persecution until they found themselves possessors of a Roman Empire whose imperial temptations eventually possessed early Christians. That situation eventually gave rise to the feudalism of the Middle Ages, which itself posed thorny problems of church and state, while kings and emperors vied with popes and bishops for political dominance. By the 20th century, the church had splintered and split, and long lost any credible claim to worldly power. The 18th and 19th centuries had been a series of awkward embraces of and cold shoulders toward the idea of political authority, and the situation was such that we could almost feel badly for those German bishops with their hands raised in the Nazi salute. To them, we can imagine, the Nazi state must have appeared like so many other modern states, where the church needed to fight and compromise to retain what influence it could retain. The only problem was that those bishops failed to notice the awful ways the Nazi state was different, how it persecuted, how it murdered, and even the Reichskonkordat that made peace between the Nazis and the Holy See in 1933 couldn't quell the sort of venom Nazis had for a young Jesuit priest who might just disagree with them. Alfred Delp, we might therefore say, had a sort of clarity about the Nazis that those bishops couldn't have, simply for the fact that he'd been arrested, he'd been given a show trial, he'd been sentenced to die, merely for planning in the waning days of the war for how a post-Nazi Germany might not devastate the German people. Perhaps we should say, too, that Delp's sensitivity to history also sharpened his perception of what was happening in his own lifetime. Whether it was these words from the tasks in front of us, whatever it was, these words from the tasks in front of us convey the depth of Delp's concern about the role played by the church in permitting Nazism to gain a grip on Germany. And in several places, Delp describes the costs. Take a few representative quotations here. First, as you've already heard, the new generation is separated from the clear conclusions of our traditional theology by a great mountain of boredom and disillusion thrown up by past experiences. But also, Delp wrote, if the churches persist in presenting humanity with the spectacle of a Christendom at loggerheads with itself, they might as well give it up. And, he wrote, the Christian idea is no longer one of the leading informative ideas today. The plundered human victim lies bleeding by the wayside. Must it be a stranger that comes to the rescue? And the burden that is pressing on the church at the present time and disturbing it so much is humans themselves. Those outside whom we cannot find a way to reach because they no longer have any belief, and those inside who no longer believe in themselves because they've experienced and given too little love. And, he wrote, in sober honesty, we must face the fact that the church today is no longer one of the controlling powers in human affairs, and that it cannot be made comparable with any other powerful historical factor, but its influence must be centered in the integration of inner life with human potentialities, and the impact made by the church's message on this plane depends on the sincerity of its transcendental surrender and devotion. Arrogance anywhere near the church is objectionable, and never more so when it occurs in the name of the church, or worse, actually as a part of the church herself. Or this last quote from Alfred Delp. Personally, I believe that unless we voluntarily stride out across new ground, leaving the well-worn paths, history in the making will destroy us with a thunderbolt of judgment. And that applies both to the personal destiny of individual churchmen and to religious institutions as a whole. It's difficult, I think, not to hear that Jesuit voice in many of those passages, and it's quite easy to be reminded of Pope Francis, a Jesuit himself. But these words also lay bare, I think, the tasks in front of us from a perspective now 8 decades old, in a way that shines a clear light on the situation of our times here, the churchmen and the Christians of our moment in 2020 in the United States, the topic to which I'll turn now, and to examine it with Delp's tasks much in our thoughts. Delp's tasks all amounted to reigniting the Christian revelation in the lives of modern men and women. The obstacles he identified, despite the challenges in the world all around the church, all came from the church itself. What's striking, of course, is that the picture Delp draws seems so familiar to us. He describes a church not only finding itself increasingly isolated from a world that no longer believes, but also enervated by its own exhaustion with internal turmoil, with disillusionment, with the failures of the church itself to respond in love to the world or even to the people of God. Our church today is not so different. We've been rocked by scandal, plagued by a polarization that's more political than conditioned by faithful witness to the gospel. And our church has lost its capacity to respond in love to the signs of the times, either as a credible citizen of the world or even as a spiritual and pastoral guide to the faithful who remain. Our church conversation today is dominated either by those who idealize a glorious past or those who plan for a frankly dismal future. The tasks in front of us are, on this view at least, not so different from the ones Delp described in Germany of the early 1940s. I think this is nowhere more clear than in an honest appraisal of the US Bishop's Faithful Citizenship document. The history of the document may be fairly well known. The bishops began to issue them with the 1976 election, the first presidential election after the Roe versus Wade decision. The determination to focus on citizenship at that time and in that way itself is suggestive of a shift in the church's public behavior. The idea that the church should have something to say in political life is a good fruit of the Second Vatican Council. And so is the idea that lay Catholics should receive some sort of formation for their citizenship. But the Faithful Citizenship document also followed unsuccessful attempts to lobby the Democratic and Republican nominees that year, Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. And very quickly, the matter of faithful citizenship began to take on the characteristics of a political campaign. Especially because from 1976 onward, the Republican Party seized on Catholic opposition to abortion in order to win Catholic voters. The fact of a partisan division over the issue most publicly and visibly animating the US bishops inevitably tended to make the church seem increasingly partisan. Many things can be said about the Faithful Citizenship document, but one is that the era of Faithful Citizenship documents has been an era in which Catholic voters drifted into the Republican Party in greater and greater numbers. We want to be fair and note that the faithful citizenship documents have, by and large, reflected Catholic social teaching very well in all its nonpartisan complexity. That shouldn't surprise us. The first faithful citizenship documents were written under the then president of the US bishops, then Archbishop Joseph Bernardin, who would later articulate the consistent ethic of life in 1983. Even in more recent years, the US Conference of Catholic Bishops has continued to insist that the consistent ethic of life approach has been present and actively advanced by faithful citizenship all along. That's true. But I think it also is fair to say that no matter what the emphasis of the document's text has been, that drift of Catholic voters toward the Republican Party during the last 40 years has not happened all by itself. It could be tempting to say it all began when Peoria Bishop Thomas Paprocki made a number of coded statements in 2012 intending to tell Catholics not to vote for a Democrat. It may be tempting, too, to think it all began when Colorado Springs Bishop Michael Sheridan and La Crosse, Wisconsin, then Bishop Raymond Burke, joined the authors of a joint pastoral letter for the dioceses of Charlotte, Charleston, and the Archdiocese of Atlanta, and other bishops in telling John Kerry not to present himself for communion in their diocese in 2004. Maybe we want to look back even further to the 1984 presidential race when bishops weighed in variously against Catholic vice presidential nominee Geraldine Ferraro and almost Democratic presidential candidate Mario Cuomo. But wherever we fix the start point, the pattern remains the same. Throughout decades of teaching about faithful citizenship, bishops consistently have favored first abortion, then LGBT issues, and eventually a religious freedom argument that amounted to opposing Obamacare in order to oppose Democrats and support Republicans. There have been exceptions, of course. The pattern is undeniable. It's gone on for decades. And the pattern has had an even more recent and frankly more troubling expression in the current election cycle. Last year, you may have seen the reporting about how the Bishops' Conference couldn't agree about how to update faithful citizenship. Instead, they revised the old one that had been written in 2007. Before Obama became president, before Francis was elected pope, and during what seems now like an entirely different era in the nation and the church. To that older document, the bishops added an introductory letter and some videos for the 2020 election, but the effort seems entirely inadequate, particularly given the sheer weight of papal social teaching that we've seen since 2007. Benedict XVI's encyclical Caritas in Veritate, Francis's Evangelii Gaudium, and the earth-shaking change of Laudato Si in 2015. The real reason the bishops declined to revise faithful citizenship despite all that, I think, is they were reluctant to lay bare the divisions among them, as a mixture of Benedict and Francis bishops, in the process of creating a new document. They were able to agree about one thing, though, and we find it in that introductory letter added to the 2007 edition of Faithful Citizenship. Quote, "The threat of abortion remains our preeminent priority." Even now, among all the other grave moral issues we face, and after 50 years of fruitless activism to overturn Roe that has cost the church so much credibility to use its voice elsewhere in public debate, the one position restated with clarity and given 2 whole paragraphs in what little of faithful citizenship was updated is the preeminence of abortion. The detention of children at the border, injustices against migrants, gun violence, climate change, and racism, they're mentioned, merely mentioned. It is, at least it seems to me, a startling statement of how little our bishops believe their voice even matters anymore. When we're thinking about how all this fits into Alfred Delp's analysis and what it can tell us about the tasks in front of us, now here today in particular, I'd want to zero in on the Cardinal Archbishop of New York, whose actions this spring, I think, have brought us to a moment in the life of the Catholic Church in the United States that we need to devote some attention to. First for US Catholic, and then later republished in the National Catholic Reporter, and it's a long story, and if you want to know more about it, please Google it. I wrote about how Cardinal Timothy Dolan has brought the Church in the United States to a sort of a Rubicon moment, a moment from which American Catholicism cannot turn back. Cardinal Dolan joined an April 25th conference call with the president where he joked that his 90-year-old mom in Missouri says the cardinal calls Trump more than he calls her. This was the same call, by the way, where Donald Trump identified himself as the best president in the history of the Catholic Church. The next morning, in a live stream mass from St. Patrick's Cathedral, Cardinal Dolan offered, I thought, a rather anodyne acknowledgement that the president supposedly was watching, and offering prayers for the president and the First Lady, as he should. The controversy grew through the week that followed. And as controversy grew, Dolan appeared first on Fox News on April 27th to say, the president has seemed particularly sensitive to the religious community, and I'm in great admiration of his leadership. Then later the same week, he returned to the subject yet again in an interview with America Magazine's editor, Matt Malone, and again on his Sirius XM radio show to defend himself and Trump. Smart observers all agreed that Cardinal Dolan was being very savvy to curry favor with the White House at a time when decisions were being made about federal bailouts that might have helped Catholic schools during the pandemic. Perhaps. But in the first place, Cardinal Dolan learned the value of all that obsequious flattery the hard way when Catholic schools later were excluded from bailout plans despite his subservient praises for the president. By May 19th, the Cardinal was reduced to complaining to Education Secretary Betsy DeVos on his radio program, I'm sure you and the president and Democrats and Republicans who are fair-minded are going to try to rectify that, to allocate funding for Catholic schools. One could imagine the Cardinal's disappointment if all his efforts to soothe the president's nervous ego had yielded him nothing in the transaction. But second, and more importantly, a lobbyist's zeal for his schools doesn't seem to explain all of Cardinal Dolan's behavior. Mere weeks after the Trump phone call and Cardinal Dolan's defenses, a protest movement took hold of American streets. Americans of every race, age group, and class were outraged by police violence directed against communities of color. Even while they passed outside down Fifth Avenue, the protests did not interrupt the release of a series of videos that ran from May 18th until June 23rd, Our Spiritual Home, in which Cardinal Dolan gives a guided tour of the art and architecture at St. Patrick's Cathedral, admiring a stone building, while the people of God marched outside to hold up living stones and to speak against their rejection. The tone deafness was not hard to miss. So was the tone deafness of two opinion essays Cardinal Dolan published as June ended. The first, defending statues from the activists who are pulling them down, and the second, defending police. I really don't want to pick on Cardinal Dolan too much, but he's had quite a last few months, and his case is so extraordinary that it's impossible to overlook him when I'm trying to hold up the problems we encounter in the approach of the faithful citizenship documents, while we're also thinking about Delp's reflections on where the church in Germany found itself in the 40s, the similar place where I'm suggesting we find the church today. The weary, exhausted, and internally focused church that Delp lamented was one that seemed incapable of rousing itself to face the challenges Nazism posed to real Christian faith in those days. In fact, the church really couldn't even address itself to women and men in any meaningful way. On some level, it was a church that seemed as though it had given up. And in that long recitation of Cardinal Dolan's recent activities, I want to draw a similar picture here today. Battered by scandal, plagued by disaffiliation, hobbled by its own flat-footed responses to the crises it's faced, and yes, surrounded by a world growing more secular by the day, the church seems to have little to say at all to us. When it does have something to say, we're handed a document. The newest Faithful Citizenship document is 53 pages long, and you'll forgive me if I've taught undergraduates for too long, but I don't think most Catholics read it. As for the lives of inspiring Christian witness that we long for in our spiritual leaders, well, there have been some. Bishop Mark Seitz kneeled at a Black Lives Matter protest in Texas, and Archbishop Wilton Gregory offered a pointed criticism of the president's cynical visit to the John Paul II shrine in Washington. Outbreaks of holiness are known to burst out. But when I say the bishops, the synecdoche is apt to conjure something else since Boston, since 2004's Wafer Wars, over giving communion to Catholic Democrats, since McCarrick, since Vigano, and now since Dolan. Faithful citizenship will not make lay Catholics more faithful citizens than the models they can see in their church. And if it is holiness they're looking for, we can't blame lay Catholics if they go away as disappointed as the rich young man. The situation really could not be worse for citizenship or for faith. We have reached, I believe, a breaking point. But before I leave this topic, I do want to add one more thought. It's not fair at all simply to blame the bishops and move on. there is plenty of blame for lay women and men too. The Pew Forum published polling last year that looked at a range of important political issues that Catholics should be concerned about: abortion, the death penalty, immigration, climate change, poverty. The results were dismaying. It made no difference, issue after issue. When Catholic Democrats were separated out from all Democrats, and when Catholic Republicans were separated out from all Republicans, the difference between Catholic Democrats and all Democrats was what we call in political science statistically insignificant. The same was true of the difference between Catholic Republicans and all Republicans. Up and down, the whole range of issues, Pew found that being Catholic simply made no difference at all. We are defined by political divisions. I heard a presentation from PBS NewsHour's Mark Shields, a Catholic, in 1996. I remember it well when he said, "There's no such thing as the Catholic vote." Well, Pew finally has measured it. Shields was right. 44 years of faithful citizenship. And this is what we have to show for it. But let me now finally, at long last, move toward my conclusion with a controversial and almost heretical thought. What if the fact that faithful citizenship and all of that effort the bishops have made since Vatican II has made no difference? What if that is good news? Let's take that thought up for a minute. Thinking about forming consciences for faithful citizenship, which is a good and noble thing for the church and our bishops to want to do, what if we've been after the wrong goal the whole time? What would it really mean for us to say, in fact, that there should be a Catholic vote? Should all Catholics vote the same way? The long tradition of the church says we can exercise prudential judgment over the issues we face. We can see political questions differently in the light of the faith. We can disagree with each other and still be good Catholics. Should we want there to be something like a Catholic political party where all of the Catholics are working together toward public policy outcomes that align to Catholic social teaching? Sounds like a nice idea, but the prudential judgment problem comes roaring right back at us. We are bound to disagree with one another based on our circumstances. And anyway, the idea of the whole church agreeing about something should seem like nonsense anyhow. Look at the church. Does that seem possible? And for that matter, when in our history was that ever true? At this point, the argument usually shifts away from the questions of prudential judgment to the idea of non-negotiable moral issues. In other words, we come back to abortion. The argument usually runs like this: sure, Catholics can disagree about effective tax rates and criminal justice reform, but there's no room for disagreeing about abortion, about marriage being between one man and one woman, about euthanasia, or about freedom of conscience. That's a very familiar way of looking at things, and it's more or less why the US bishops still identify abortion as the preeminent moral issue. It'll take a moment or two for us to see why, but this argument, when we look closely, I think also crumbles in more or less the same way the other arguments for a Catholic vote crumble. It's important to take some time and see that. That idea about prudential judgment being important to politics tells us something about what we're doing when we're discussing political issues. The church, and here the church is leaning on pre-Christian Aristotle, always has taught us that politics is a realm of prudence. That is to say, it's a place for good judgment. There are several reasons, but I want to highlight two. One reason is because no one knows the future. When we make choices in politics, we're making guesses about which way is the right way to go. It's not exactly like choosing the right way in ethics, however. Ethics and moral theology are concerned with what is right essentially, as in the difference between right and wrong. In the more practical terms of the world of politics, making the right choice is less about being right in that absolute sense than about guessing which choice will take us to the best future. We guess, but we don't know. And that brings me to the second, very closely related reason why the church always has highlighted prudence when talking about politics. When we're guessing about the future, we're working with unknowable variables. What other events will intrude, how other people will react, what are the unforeseen consequences, and so on. And in order to anticipate those things and uncountable other things that are difficult to foresee, we depend on experience and expertise. The prudence that leads to right judgment itself depends on right judgment. Prudent decision-making leads to a prudent outcome. In other words, and to be clearer about it, Prudence not only demands some capacity to guess correctly about the future, it also depends on some ability to know the most effective way to reach the right outcome. Prudence really, in this sense, we mean effectiveness, is the highest political virtue. In politics, being right in an absolute ethical sense, but being ineffective, is very much like being wrong in an absolute ethical sense. Ineffective righteousness does no practical good in the world where we live. A long preoccupation with being right in an absolute ethical sense has dominated how the church has told us to think as Catholic citizens in the United States. Almost 50 years later, though, has it stopped even one abortion? Has it been effective in any way we can see? Confusing politics with ethics and morality, I'm saying, has been costly. Politics isn't completely separated from morality and ethics, of course. Ethics and moral theology have to inform our practical choice making. But politics is different because politics is concerned with prudence. It's about effectiveness. And we haven't been effective. I'm saying it's because we're trying to answer the wrong question. We're trying to manufacture a Catholic vote out of the Catechism's answers to moral and ethical questions. We're trying to impose our non-negotiables on a political community that doesn't share our faith, and the results have been depressingly predictable. We have failed to persuade, and we've lost a lot of credibility to persuade. We're isolated by our righteousness. What might be better? That's a fair question. For an answer, let's look back to Alfred Delp. We've heard him say this already. In sober honesty, we must face the fact the church today is no longer one of the controlling powers in human affairs. It cannot be made comparable with any other powerful historical factor, but its influence must be centered on the integration of inner life with human potentialities. Let's focus on that last phrase, the integration of inner life with human potentialities, because it gets to the heart of what it means to be a Catholic voter. It gets to what faithful citizenship documents have failed to do, what they can't do. It discloses precisely why this whole approach has been wrong. What does it mean to integrate the inner life with human potentialities? It means that we become cunning as snakes, yet innocent as doves. It means we come to be at rest in a world that will never satisfy our longing for justice, mercy, and peace. It means, really, that each of us must undergo an inner conversion to the demanding call of the gospel, and then each of us assess the potential for effectiveness of what we believe in a world that will never help us feel at home for what we believe as Christians. It means that we integrate our full conversion with our understanding that the reign of God is at hand, but not yet here. And so we strain to be as effective as we can be. And that means we'll disagree. When Paul Ryan says he believes that a freer market, lowering marginal and capital gains tax rates will serve the poor and raise people out of poverty, I can say I think that's bad economics. But I have a harder time saying it's bad Christianity, because he's guided by the common good as his goal, and he's chosen what seems to him like an effective path toward that goal. That's what a Catholic should do in public life. When Nancy Pelosi says our best opposition to abortion might be to eliminate the economic and social conditions that make childbearing and childrearing seem frightening or impossible, her reasons might include the fact that abortion is now a long-settled constitutional precedent, or even the idea that it's just for a woman to exercise the same authority to make medical decisions about her own body that a man has. This is, again, what a Catholic should do in public life. She's chosen a path to make abortions less likely to occur, the path that seems most effective to her. She's charted the course to a goal that Catholics should embrace in a way that seems to her like the shortest distance between 2 points. We can disagree about how realistic her judgment is for one reason or another, but this is what politics looks like, and we need to do a better job appreciating that. In other words, as I say, perhaps it's not such a bad thing that 50 years of faithful citizenship has left Catholic voters looking more or less exactly like non-Catholic voters. Maybe the actual public policy outcomes are what they always would have and should have been on abortion, on taxes, on poverty, on everything. But what has been lost in the way that we've done it is the credibility of the church and its leaders to form and shape opinion, to be a voice for the voiceless, to win souls for the reign of God, because they've spent so much time trying to win something, trying to apply political pressure, trying to bend the world to a shape determined by a book of moral theology. Well, what they ought to have been doing is calling us all to deeper conversion, not to be better citizens, but to be better Christians, with inner lives attuned to the potentialities of the world, so that we can become as cunning as serpents and as innocent as doves. What is the church today? Here I'll quote Delp again. It's a church that makes demands in the name of a peremptory God and no longer carries weight in a world of changing values. It's a church that faces a new generation separated from the clear conclusions of our traditional theology by that great mountain of boredom and disillusion. And it's a church that turns to the world when the world comes looking for enlightenment with those pious words and fervent gestures. The tasks in front of us here today, amid ongoing racial injustice, amid a pandemic, amid rampant inequality, polarization, and the coarseness and violence that permeates our public life, the task in front of us is to do better. We need to bear witness to something better. And the way we begin is to agree with Delp. There are some bitter things to say about the contribution made by the churches to this world. Still, the church is the people of God. And so what will we do about it? I spoke recently to a convert to Catholicism, and she explained why she converted. She told me, "I like that the Catholic Church gives you answers, tells you the right thing to do." And I don't want to embarrass her by naming her, but I only quote her because this reply is so typical of the problem. The attitude is widespread and it's wrong. It is finally our problem. The only formula for a truly Catholic vote is the one that Jesus gave to the rich young man. And it's not necessarily to sell all that you have, unless that's the thing that challenges you to re-examine your life and your relationships to others in the world. That's the one thing that's demanded from us, not just as thoughtful citizens, but also as believers in the gospel. We have to struggle to integrate the gospel into our lives and our believing lives then into the world. We have to be willing to struggle because the tasks in front of us are too great, and this moment is too challenging for the complacency of pious words, fervent gestures, and pat answers any longer to be acceptable. Our salvation doesn't depend on any public policy or political outcome. The task in front of us amounts only to this prayer. In an Advent reflection Delp wrote from his prison cell in 1944, the task before us is this: may God break open the narrowness that confines us within ourselves and make us capable of Him and capable of His mission. No formula, no easy answers, no victory lap, only a hope to possess and a task to perform each day as voters, as believers, as, in Pope Francis' words, missionary disciples. Those are the tasks in front of us, faithful citizens, right here and now in 2020. Only we, each of us acting in history, can fulfill them, and we need to get to work. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Steve. We have about 10 minutes. I know one or two are going to hop off a few minutes beforehand because you've got other Zoom or webinars or classes to attend, so feel free. But I'm going to unmute all, and then I shall be quiet. And then if, given the time, again, if you'd like to say your name, where you're calling from, and a succinct question, we shall go from there.
And I'll offer a succinct answer.
And as I unmute all, if you don't have a question at the moment, feel free to mute yourself and unmute yourself. Any questions?
Sorry, may I pose a question? I come across a lot of Catholics who are, very conscious of our social justice history and yet vote solely on the abortion issue. I'm wondering if you're seeing any change in that kind of mindset in 2020. And I know that, the Catholic vote did go to Trump in 2016, but are we seeing any shifts now that we've lived with this president for nearly 4 years?
The answer to the second question is easiest. Trump, of course, did win the overall Catholic vote, but what he really won was the white Catholic vote. And there was a poll out this spring that suggested that he had gone from 60% of white Catholic support to 39% of white Catholic support. So I do think that's one shift underway. The first question is a little bit more difficult to answer because we don't really have any data yet. There's a lot of anecdotal stuff, but I think we're hamstrung a little bit too by the fact that as a church we have a hard time coming together in these circumstances. It's a little harder to feel the pulse of my parish or my archdiocese, and I'm not really sure that I trust a lot of the opinion journalism and tweets that we read. I'll believe a lot of stuff when we finally get to an election and an outcome. I think, though, what I would prefer to say is it's very clear to me, in the light of the events that we're living through, and in the light of the way that the church has had a fairly muted response, for example, to George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests that follow, and the light that that has shown on the public witness of the church. I would also add, too, I think many of us, I've had the experience, what we have learned is that our parishes and our pastors have a hard time figuring out what their ministry is if they don't have masses to say. And I think it's posed a lot of questions about how we come together as a church community. All of that is just to say as succinctly as I can that I think that we're in too unsettled a moment to know which way things are going to break. And maybe even some of it depends on how much longer this isolation goes and what the longer effect is going to be on the church. But I do feel the moment is pregnant with possibility for a new kind of public witness and a new kind of church to be born out of it.
I totally enjoy your hopeful statement there. I try to remain hopeful myself. I live in Madison, Wisconsin, and we have a new bishop, and he's been there about a year, and he's been trying really hard to listen to everybody. But a few weeks ago, he came out with, his first big initiative, which was evangelization. About a week later, the church is reopened to, initially it was going to be 25%, and a lot of the parishes had sign-up sheets and all this kind of thing. But then because of a court decision, our Wisconsin Supreme Court, which has become extremely conservative, the governor's reopening, which would have been at 25%, was pushed back to local control, and our local county health department said, no, you can only have, 50 people or 25%, whichever was lower. So this is a long way of saying the first thing that came out a week after this new wonderful evangelization, effort, become faithful citizens, by living, Christ's life and so forth. And you're great examples. And the first thing that came out was a letter from the Becket Fund to the county, to the county administrator saying, we want to have at least 25%, and how dare you say not? And so what do people say? I mean, here we are. I was in conversation with some people, and I said, if the song says, they'll know we are Christians by our love, what we're seeing in action is, they'll know we are Catholics by our lawsuits. You can reuse that.
I might.
It's difficult. I mean, that was just one little piece, the Becket Fund thing, because otherwise they would have had a lawsuit. But the LGBT, the abortion stuff, I have no clue what religious liberty is anymore.
Yeah, we live in a strange time when a measure of religious liberty is how free a church is to make its parishioners sick. Right? But I think in some ways this goes back to Judy's question too about the ways in which that strange bifurcation between the broader social witness of the church, but then we're only going to vote on abortion. And what it is it's the effectiveness of messaging over time. It's what people hear. because most people aren't going to read the 53-page document. Most people aren't going to read Laudato Si. And so people get what they get by what they hear in a homily, right? By what they may hear read from a bishop's letter, and certainly from what they hear on the news when prominent bishops and prominent Catholics have something to say. All of this, I'm saying, has been built from a decision that was made in the 70s to engage the political world as political actors. And it leads inevitably to litigiousness, right? It leads inevitably to the lawsuit. When you embark on trying to change the world as lobbyists and pressure groups, you end by suing your way to social justice. And the larger answer is that maybe we should worry less about the outcomes. Maybe we should worry a little bit less about what the law says. Maybe we should worry a little bit less about the status of public policy today. And maybe we should worry more about the Christian lives and the lives of Christian witness that Catholic men and women are living all over the place. Turn them loose then, once they have had that deeper conversion, turn them loose and the world will be fine. But first have the deeper conversion.
Hi, my name's Pat White. I'm from Chicago. I have been struggling to, I'm usually a very optimistic person, but I have become more and more cynical with all of this. And so in the Archdiocese of Chicago, you know, we have Renew My Church. And that has the elements of evangelization. It has all sorts of wonderful things as part of it. But really, it's closing parishes. It's, you know, and so when that becomes, and I understand you can't run these buildings without money, you know, you have to do something, but I wish we wouldn't cloud the facts. And I think that's also part of what places the church in a less positive light, because we just can't state out the truth clearly.
I agree. But I also want to say that the Holy Spirit is going to have the last laugh. One of the reasons why I have a strange backwards kind of hope in this awful moment that we're living in, and I think really it could be a chrysalis for something different and better, is because right here in Chicago, where I am too, this process of restructuring that we're calling Renew My Church has gotten caught up in this new reality of parish life that we're living in that's been disclosed by the fact that we can't go to Mass. That really forces everybody who is involved. There's going to be no getting away when we all do go back from the fact that we've had to learn how to do it a little bit differently. And it forces a reflection, first of all, on how seriously I take all of this naturally. But second, it forces a real reflection on what the parish community is and what it means in the first place. Is it really nurturing lives of missionary discipleship? Is it really a place where that deeper conversion happens? And if it isn't, why isn't it? What are we coming to these places for? I'm hopeful that Renew My Church is going to be caught up in the machinery, ground up in the gears of what's going to have to happen when we all come back together with those questions in our minds.
Time for one last question.
I was particularly interested in your talk about efficacy. I didn't think I could be any more cynical as I was back in the 60s, when I felt that, you know, if you beat your head against a brick wall, there's blood on the wall, but it's not the wall's blood, it's yours. Until the early millennium years, when I went and took a position with a lobby shop in Washington of a major financial institution, a job I held for about 15 years. And I found I was a whole lot more cynical then. And when you talk about efficacy, one thing that hit me is that when I thought I was fighting on a moral stance, an anti-war, a civil rights stance, I mean, it happened. It eventually happened, but we really weren't very effective. And when I worked through the lobby shop, we were a very large lobby shop. We were bipartisan. We hit everybody. And we were exceptionally effective. You know, I don't know that it was a moral stand though. And it worries me. Now I see the same thing. I see moral stance. I'm retired now. I see moral stances being taken, and I think, oh babies, it's you're gonna bleed.
I think about my wife's late mother, who was a teacher in the Archdiocese of Newark for many years, and for many years took school groups to the March for Life in Washington, D.C., year after year after year, from the Reagan administration to the Bush administration. I mean, W. Bush. And she finally came to the conclusion, this is a perfect waste of time. She didn't grow any less pro-life. She just came to understand and would tell you that this was about somebody's mailing list, this was about somebody's donors, and the idea of reaching a reconciliation of this issue was in some case the worst case outcome for both pro-choice and pro-life activists, because the industry needs to be fed. Now, I think that's a fairly cynical but also a fairly realistic read on what goes on. I think the question of effectiveness, though, you know, there's two ways to measure the question of effectiveness. One way is we're doing well. But the other way to measure the question of effectiveness is that the common good is effectively being served, that we are making some kind of incremental progress to bend the arc of history toward justice, right? And there certainly, while the activists have done very well and have been very effective for themselves, nobody has managed to come out looking good. Nobody has managed to come out looking good. And the common good has in demonstrable ways now. I can connect a series of dots, and it's only arguable, but I can connect a series of dots from this whole argument to the pandemic, right? The world has been ruined by partisanship and by a particular kind of effectiveness. What we have to do is we have to rethink the effectiveness that matters, what our commitment to the common good is, and where that really comes from. That's what needs to inform our behavior as citizens, as believers, in everything that we do. That's the only kind of faithful citizenship that counts. A 53-page document won't count for much.
You're right about the march. My office was at 6th in Pennsylvania, and I assure you, it was great for people to get together, and I think people need to have that affirmation in young people. But basically, all it did was screw up traffic in restaurants.
I lived in Washington for 8 years. I hear you.
Yeah.
Well, with that, I'm going to steal 90 more seconds, unless you all leave before I finish, to wrap this up, to say 5 things. And I will begin with the most important, which is thank you. Thank you to Steve for creating this, for sharing his time, for you all making it worthwhile by joining us. So thank you to Steve and to each of you. The second thing, another reminder, our prayer enrollment office remains open. However, tomorrow is the last day for Joan Diamond, who's been the prayer enrollment office manager for over 10 years. The assistant manager, Marquita White, will take over for her. So you can do your online or phone orders with the prayer enrollment office. This conference and retreat center will remain closed, as I mentioned on our last call, through at least January 1st of 2021. We will reassess our reopening in the late fall. Our next schedule begins next week. It's a 2-part series with a Cenacle auxiliary, Dr. Lee Prescott of Lantana, Florida, where she will guide us over 2 weeks on how to write our spiritual autobiography. But I also want to share, because it's just on the website today, because I just learned how to do it, Judith Valenti will be providing what I'm calling an online retreat. Unlike the Coffee with the Conference Center, you will have to register formally, and there is a fee for this retreat, but it is on what Thomas Merton can teach us in this new normal. So you can hop over to the website to learn more and to register. But I will also say, if Judith, if you want to say anything now while you have a semi-captive audience, you certainly can.
Well, it'll just be a little taste of Merton, because there's so much that we can learn from Merton now, and Steve mentioned him in his talk. But I hope it'll be a meditative experience, and a lot for you to chew on after you come to the mini retreat, we'll call it. So that's it comes from my deep love for Merton, and how Merton has been a real companion for me during this pandemic.
Wonderful. Thank you.
When is it? When is this?
Wednesday, September 16th at 10 a.m. And again, all the information is on our website. You all can leave if you need to, but I can quickly try to find the link and I can share it in this chat box. And somebody else also asked about Steve's book. Steve's written at least two. I think we're referring to the Steve, your 2018 book, The Road to Trump. I forget the name.
Good Intentions, but the book I quoted from, you may have meant, was Alfred Delp's Prison Writings, which was published by Orbis Books.
All righty. Well, again, I appreciate everyone's time, and again, Steve's, and perhaps we'll see some of you next week.
It's good to see everybody. Thank you all for coming and for staying.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.